If you hear that tape hiss, you must be back for another episode of PCU, the VHS tapes. I'm Armand, of course, joined by Pete. Pete, what's up, brother?
And I'm excited for this movie because I just watched it a couple weeks ago, so it's fresh in my mind. And I don't know, feeling that Friday night anticipation. The whole family piles into the car. You go to Blockbuster, wherever, or the corner video store, like the neighborhood
Yes.
store, and and do the battle for the tapes to see, is that fresh movie still out, or is it still in stock, or are you gonna have to pick up like last month's big movie release, and then scoop up something for like a Saturday morning, for or some My Little Pony for the little kids, and then take your stack of tapes home. Yeah, I'm ready.
At the end, I am too, dog. So I mean, look. So we're gonna talk about the criminally underappreciated Running Man, which I should note has just been re-released on DVD by Arrow Video with a 4K restoration, which is actually a copy I'm looking forward to getting a hold of myself. But The Running Man is one of Arnold Schwarzenegger's. I think it's one of his best movies. I don't know that everybody would say that, but I will say that I mean, I'm just being honest. I mean, I don't know that everybody would say. I think lots of people would say Predator was much better. The Terminator and T2. I don't think we need to discuss T3. Kindergarten Cop. Arnold Schwarzenegger in the 80s and 90s had an absolutely amazing run of movies. He did not really do a lot of, besides the Terminator, a lot of like real sci-fi movies. Well, I guess I take that back because he did have the Predator and the Terminator. So I guess right. So fine, he had a bunch of sci-fi movies. This is another one of them. But I guarantee you, this one has something that the rest of them do not have, and that is Richard Dawson, which we will get into. Which, for those of you who are old game show fans, he was the original host of Family Feud. So if you could imagine, like America's grandfather playing like America's psychopathic game show host, that's what it was, and it was awesome. So, I mean, Pete, I guess I'll, before I go into like the background, well, I guess let me touch first on the background of the movie a little bit, and then we'll get into kind of some of our personal ideas. So, the setting for the Running Man is that it's 2017, and that the United States has fallen into a dystopian reality, which was a very popular trope in the 80s because there was never a group of people that were more depressed about the future in the 80s than the Americans. Every movie, whether it was Escape from New York or The Terminator, everything was like, hey kids, future's gonna be jacked up. You better be glad you got your popcorn and your Coke and your VHS cassette tapes, because before you know it, it's gonna be time for Red Dawn. But it's set in 2017, society has collapsed, and the most popular television program in the world is a show called The Running Man, which, in a perfect foreshadowing of reality TV, is pits convicted criminals versus quote unquote stalkers / serial killers, and you're basically given a 3-hour stretch to make it through 4 sections of a destroyed Los Angeles. Don't know how part of it got destroyed. We're not supposed to ask. It's suspension of disbelief. You just gotta go with it. And they're all basically low budget Marvel villains, and that's the basic premise. And you throw in Yaphet Kotto, and Maria Conchita Alonso, who would also be in Predator 2, which I personally think was almost as good as the original Predator, but people make me talk about that on a different night because he doesn't like when I sidetrack too much. So that's the kind of background. Pete, can you remember the first time you watched The Running Man and where you were?
I think it had to be in a friend's TV room, like somebody who had HBO. Like when we were kids. First of all, my parents were never gonna let me watch The Running Man until I was probably in my teens. But that didn't stop us, latchkey Gen Xers. So. But there was always a kid in the neighborhood whose parents, were like way more permissive, and they always had cooler stuff. So, I think it was the kid who probably had, the USS Flag down in his basement, also had HBO, and I think that's when I first watched The Running Man, and it was so weird. Like, it was just so, there was something familiar about it with, Arnold being there, and it just having that familiar, action movie thing, but it also just gave like early Paul Verhoeven movie vibes. It was just uh, the director Paul Michael Glazer has done a lot of things, but there's just something so unique about how the movies look, um, and everything. And so I just kind of walked away kind of confused about what I'd seen.
I mean, I think well, I know for a fact the first time that I saw it, it was one of my notorious. My parents used to let me stay up late at night on my own because I was an only kid, and so it's like, well, what's the worst that could happen? And of course, I was always keenly aware of the fact that it was like, look, HBO gets really interesting after about 10:30, and it was
Right?
out. You were like, anything could come on tonight on HBO when the parents are asleep. And so I ended up watching The Running Man, staying up late at night, and I can remember being A, terrified, B, fascinated. Um, and to your point, it was just a really weird movie. It's because it's like the movie looks like it was shot for television, which I guess was one of the controversies for internally, because it doesn't really have it doesn't look like Arnold's films. Like when you take it and you compare it to Terminator or Total Recall or Predator, it does not look like a high budget thing. But in retrospect, that's almost part of what makes it work because it's a TV show. So it's like somehow that part being screwed up works with it. Um, it's it's really kind of like low level plot, but somehow it's enough plot and enough political commentary in it that gives the movie more oomph than it really should have. Like, I mean, in the setting for the movie, all the schools have been closed. The United States is a totalitarian state run by the cadre. They never explain who the cadre are. However, it is made perfectly clear that the cadre have their own soda, which we'll get back to before we end the conversation. And so you're trapped now in this game show, which we should say the original concept for The Running Man was written by Stephen King under the pen name of Richard Baldwin. Now, there's very little relationship between the original Stephen King movie and the actual Running Man. I should also note that, according to Wikipedia, Christopher Reeves was originally contemplated to play the main character, Ben Richards,
Mm-hmm.
which would have followed the original. I think at the time they were looking at following the original source material more. Which Pete,
Right.
when you and I were talking about this before we started recording, you told me that they're now actually working on a Running Man reboot that's going to more closely follow the book.
I'm sure this is going to confuse and anger all kinds of people who are going to look at the movie as the original source material, but whatever. Yeah, Paramount announced it's going to make a new adaptation of the novel um, that would be more faithful to source material. So it's going to be very different from the movie, and so I'm extremely interested in seeing
Well,
what they're going to do with that.
I mean, after Dune, I'm willing to give remakes a try. I won't give them an automatic pass, but I'll give them a try.
Hmm.
But so Arnold Schwarzenegger's character Ben Richards is a helicopter pilot. He's ordered to fire on helpless civilians. He refuses. He's arrested. Basically, through a series of events, he's at the beginning. There's a big prison break with Schwarzenegger and Yaphet Kotto. Who, for those of you who don't remember, Yaphet Kotto, legendary actor who just passed not that long ago. When you think of the original Alien, you think of Live and Let Die. So maybe not an iconic actor from the standpoint of always kind of being an A-list out there out front, but was a very significant Black actor in a time period where there were very few roles for Black actors and always chewed up the scene whenever he was in it. Um, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Yaphet Kotto escape. They run into Mick Fleetwood, who's the leader of the resistance, and I believe Dweezil Zappa.
Yes.
For you rock and roll fans who represent the resistance, he gets himself free, goes to look for his brother, finds out his brother's been sent to a re-education camp. Just ends up taking a hostage in the form of Maria Conchita Alonso playing Amber Mendez, who I will say, while I am not of Latin heritage, I was genuinely annoyed with some of the dialogue that they gave her because there was literally like an I caramba in there, and I was like, oh, come on, man, like damn. Um, but so then at that point, she betrays him. He gets caught. Our villain Richard Dawson, who plays a wonderful game show host Killian, the creator of The Running Man, gives Ben Richards the option of either you can go voluntarily go on the show, or I'm going to send your friends instead. And the villain being the villain, he just sends all three of them in, and and the hijinks, and the shenanigans all begin from there. Um, let's talk about the villains for a second. Richard Dawson. It's really hard for me to explain to anybody who was not alive during this time period how kind of safe and warm and just genuinely fluffy Richard Dawson was perceived as being the host of Family Feud. I mean, to be a game show host in America in the 1980s, you were like the least threatening white man alive. Like, Pat Sajak was a little gangster. I mean, like, so it was such a huge reversal because I remember when I first saw the movie, my first thought was, "Oh my God, it's the guy from Family Feud, and he's killing people. Like, what the hell is going on?" But because Richard Dawson had been an actual game show host, he understands the psychology of Killian so well that it's genuinely frustrating. Oh, I should also mention he was in Hogan's Heroes. If you don't know what Hogan's Heroes is, you should Google it, and then you should try to make an effort to watch it, at least an episode or two. Hogan's Heroes, fantastic. Watched it with my dad growing up. It's you'll thank me. But Richard Dawson, because of his experience, I felt like he brought so much to the character that he gave the character a seriousness that it didn't deserve considering the movie that we're in. But it does kind of elevate it. I mean, Pete, what did you think about Richard Dawson as Killian?
It was unusual for us, like, especially for a villain in an Arnold Schwarzenegger film. It was odd for it to not be just Brawn versus Brawn, or Brawn versus a giant army, and then the Weasley villain. But that's really just kind of how it always worked out. And this was, yeah, there was menace, and it was weird. It was interesting to see menace coming from somebody who was presenting it with a smile.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the thing because I mean, he's menacing, and you never really. It takes you a while to really embrace the fact that there's absolutely nothing morally redeemable about him. Like, there's a wonderful scene where he's trying to select candidates to appear on the Running Man, and they're like, "Hey, what about this guy who jumped up and killed his wife and his mother at a dinner party?" He was like, "Yeah, see, he's like, I like that. It's got a nice quality." He was a
Mhm.
quiet man. It was just like, oh, oh, damn. I mean, and they get to the my other kind of favorite line from that moment. We're like, "Hey, Damon, how about we try to use one of the bank robbers with the bank robbers with the suicide pact?" And he's like, "Did they commit suicide?" "Well, obviously not." "Well, then they're unreliable."
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so,
There's a
and
coldness to him that was enjoyable, and also, I don't know. I felt it was really early in my life to understand how, commercial exploitation of human beings worked. And
yes,
this movie illustrated that in a way that was also not subtle. So there was no missing that point. And that was it wasn't lost on me even as a kid. It just sat with me though in a weird sour kind of way because I'm like, well, that's I yeah, I was a little too young to have my idealism taken away that early.
I mean, the other thing that I'll say is that, for a lot of Schwarzenegger's adversaries, they're all intended to be somebody that's physically imposing, that looks
Hmm.
like they could pose some physical threat to Arnold. And I think that one of the things that makes Killian really unique is that there's never a moment that he's a physical threat. It's the amount of power that he wields and the dictatorial control that he basically has over Schwarzenegger's life at this point, that makes him terrifying. I mean, and look, this is a really campy Schwarzenegger movie. I mean, it's literally populated by like a series of one-liners. I'm almost willing, I'm almost willing to bet you that you would not be able to legally drive if you played a shot game about take a shot every time he has a one-liner in this movie.
I mean,
I
everything is stunt casting. Every
yes.
single character feels like a stunt cast from, yeah, from people who were known but not household names in the early 80s.
So, but I mean, my last point about Killian, I think one of the best lines in the entire movie is they try to use the callback to the Terminator. He's like, "Killian, I'll be back. Killian pauses for a moment, smirks, and says, "Only in a rerun." And that kind of captures the essence of kind of the character and kind of the back and forth. Which, to be honest, the adversarial relationship between Killian and Schwarzenegger, and Killian's kind of overall performance on the game show really kind of gives it makes the movie very surreal. Having said that, we haven't talked about our stalkers yet. Um, you would have thought they would have come up with like a catchier name because basically they're bounty hunters slash serial killers. But if you could imagine like taking some C-list Marvel comic book characters and mixing them in with the characters from Street Fighter 2, that's kind of what you would get in terms of them. So you've got Jim Brown, the legendary Jim Brown. So you've got him. You've got Jesse Ventura, Governor Jesse Ventura, as Captain Freedom, um, Erland Van Leith, who I actually think, unfortunately, he died shortly after the filming of the movie. He was an actual opera singer,
Mm-hmm.
Who played Dynamo, who literally had his own quick blurb of opera singing before he started electrocuting and killing people. We have Professor Toru Tanaka as Professor Sub Zero. For old school wrestling fans, if you look up Professor Tanaka, you can't like as a kid, he was one of, I mean, other than Schwarzenegger, he was like the second most recognizable person. I was like, oh crap, it's the guy from the WW and the WWF. Notice I didn't say the WWE because it wasn't the WWE. It was the WWF before the World Wildlife, folks sued them. Um, but yeah, so I mean, you've got these really comic book characters, not to mention Gus Rethwish as Eddie Buzzsaw Vitowski, which I will just say we'll get to Buzzsaw literally in one moment. But if you could imagine, and I mean this nicely, if you could imagine a Confederate from deep down south with an adamantium chainsaw, that's Buzzsaw. So that's the competition that Schwarzenegger's got up against. Let's take him in order in terms of who gets killed. So first, Professor Sub Zero. What was your take of the character and his, I guess, really brief moment in the movie?
It's so weird now watching it because you're like, I know so many characters named Sub-Zero that it just felt like American Gladiators. Um, it having taken place before American Gladiators, but watching it with this lens, I'm like, man, there's so much influence from this movie on so many things in such a weird way. One of the things that is just so different between the novel and the movie is the portrayal of the stalkers um and I love them all. I love how cartoonish and weird they
Okay, well, I mean, if you could just really quickly, what's the difference between the stalkers in the book and the stalkers in the movie?
are. I mean, they're just people. They're not. I mean, this isn't. It isn't a. You know, I don't even know. It isn't like pick a prom theme and then make it deadly. It's a little more subtle. I mean, everything else in the book kind of is, at least as far as I can tell. Like I really want to finish it. But there's still that like charm of the movie, and I don't know if we talked about this before, but like, part of the charm. Whenever I watch movies that are based on books, I feel like we always want to know, how much it deviates from the source material, and if we've read it, then it becomes a whole thing. And especially, this is something I even thought young, or even thought early on with this movie, is having never read the book, if this is based on like the plot of, a Stephen King book, because Richard Bachman was like the least best, it's like the worst kept secret in literature. Like everyone knew, and everyone wanted to tell you, like you were the only person who had no idea that like Richard Bachman and Stephen King. But when that's your source material, then it's like, well, you really don't need to change anything. Like you really don't need to, you just don't mess with it. And it's so different from the source material, with the exception of, this person who's trying to survive long enough to, win a bunch of money. The stakes are higher in the book where he's, trying to like feed his family, right? Trying to take care of his family, knowing even if he dies, he'll be able to do that. Whereas, the movies, uh, is more just about this, weird prison system, or weird way of, using prisoners.
We're fighting for the revolution, baby. We
Right.
going from the we're going from the game show straight, straight to the people's revolution.
hmm
Um, okay,
So, and in the book, it is more of like one man's quest, and it ends similarly, but for very different reasons and in very different ways. So, anyway,
yeah,
but it's so strange because I feel like it's so deviated from the source material, yet at the same time it does tell this like really serious dystopian story, that has its own point of view.
no, all right, no, that's interesting. All right, so now Pete's made it so that I have to go back and read the book now, which I know I'm going to read it and be like, but there's nobody who gets castrated with their own weapon, and how
But
how
you
do I
are
feel
a
about that?
reader, so.
Yes, that's true. So Buzzsaw, as I alluded to,
Yeah.
um, they're really, I think his death really is the biggest topic of conversations. I mean, like, look, visually, he's a really, really big, like 1980s. I'm not saying that that man was on steroids, but in the 1980s, when you think about people on steroids, your expectation was that they look like that. Um, Absolutely huge. The first time we see him, he's lifting his motorcycle off the back of a pickup truck, hoisting it up in the air, smiling before he drops it. And we, it is funny because it's like it really does have moments where it feels like Street Fighter. Every stalker before they go to kill Schwarzenegger, they're introduced to the home audience and they get a moment to show off their weapon before they go. Um, so
That's my favorite.
but
One of my favorite parts, because you get to see like those crowd scenes of the bloodthirsty grandmas. And let me tell you that when it comes to layers of villains, like the bloodthirsty grandmas are at the top of my list, even though they do no evil act. They are there supporting it
oh,
wholeheartedly.
oh yes, I mean all the way to the hilt. I mean, no, that's a good point. So, our boy Buzzsaw finally catches up with Arnold Schwarzenegger. He ends up being responsible for the death of Yaphet Kotter's character, William Laughlin. Um, and then Schwarzenegger, in order to defeat him, first there's the signature line: "This saw is like a part of me. I'm gonna make it a part of you." To which Schwarzenegger, of course, flips it over, manages to put it in between his legs. And one of the most obvious setups for a villain kill that you're ever going to see. And then you would think, maybe they would try to treat this with some kind of decency or whatever. And it's no, we're not going to show you getting this man his testicles cut off. What we're going to do is have him sing like an opera singer as his testicles are being cut off. And then he just drops and he dies. And
hmm
then good old Eddie's fashion, we're not going to show you the gore. We're going to show you the aftermath. So later on, you see his little belt, and the belt buzzsaw has been cut in half. And, and it's and of course, with Schwarzenegger, is always the one liner. So when he kills Sub Zero, he was like, "Here's Sub Zero. Now, Plane Zero." For Buzzsaw,
That was
it's
one of the
like,
better ones too.
for Buzzsaw, what happened to Buzzsaw? Oh, he had to split.
Mhm.
Um,
That fight though was just this was the 80s when like one or two of your fight scenes could just phone it right the hell in. This thing is like 30 is like 2 straight minutes of just grappling. There was no
yes,
stunt coordinator that day. It was just grab each other's hands and strain. If you get a hernia, contact. We'll get the ambulance here. And that was literally it. Like it's just the two of them fighting over a chainsaw in the most exhausting way to watch. Uh,
yes, and I will
humanly
tell you this
possible.
right now. If you're like me and you're a stickler for details, if you notice closely, the chainsaw is absolutely not moving when it's close to Schwarzenegger. When it's away from Schwarzenegger, oh, the chainsaw is running, which I thought was like nowadays we use CGI to cover that, but I guess for actor safety, they really had to be like, dude's worth a couple $100 million, $100 million. You cannot have a live chainsaw running near Arnold Schwarzenegger's face under any circumstances. Um, Now it'll all be CGI'd. So we leave Professor Sub Zero and Buzzsaw. We make our way. I'm gonna cover Dynamo last because technically he dies last, even though from the purposes of the movie, there's a showdown with Dynamo. The crowd gets clued into the fact. Well, you know what the hell? Just to talk about Dynamo. Dynamo is an opera singer. He's also an opera singer who uses a suit of electricity. So think of him as the electric Iron Man who cannot fly, but he does have a car that he uses, which is kind of like a souped up go kart when you see it in the movie with razor blades on the front of the car. Why you have electricity and razor blades and a souped up go kart? I don't know.
Look,
Let's just go with it.
he's got that Christmas light armor that I already love.
Yes,
Um, like if you're trying to do Tron practical in like 1983, this is how you would do it. It's just with a lot of Christmas lights.
okay, it's more like cosplay Tron circa 1986. I mean, like it does not. You see it as seeing how this is the guy who was in visionary films like the Terminator and cutting edge movies at the time like Predator. You do not see Dynamo and think that's the level of special effects that I expect to see at an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. You're like, oh, this is gonna be like Commando. This is one of those he was slumming it, or like Raw Heat. This is not one of the big one of the big ones. So no, so Dynamo, his way of defeating Dynamo is to get Dynamo to chase him, and he runs him up a pile of junk, and the guy's car tips over. I'm not lying. And then
I mean, first of all, Dynamo's car is going so slow that Arnold Schwarzenegger continues to outrun it. Like, not just get ahead of it, but like start to pull ahead. Um, I didn't know he could run that fast. I didn't know cars could drive that slow. Like it seems like Dynamo's car was was just a bunch of sheet metal, welded onto a Cushman or a golf cart, and that's probably why the death he receives is that. Uh,
yes. So I should say one the whole we forgot one big important fact. Arnold Schwarzenegger's character has been through government propaganda. It has been watching the show have the impression that he is the quote unquote butcher or Bakersfield, have been responsible for having killed all these innocent people. The audience's first time that they're clued into the fact that they're being lied to is when he refuses to kill Dynamo because he says, "I will not kill a helpless human being, not even a sadistic piece of scum like you," which I thought was a wonderful line and a wonderful brush off again in a movie that has nothing but one liners. Another great line of dialogue. So Dynamo gets killed later on after in one of the strangest attempted rape scenes I think of any 1980s movie. Tries to rape Amber Mendez, played by Maria Conchita Alonso, who herself has a great line when she says to him, because there's nothing funny about a dickless wonder with a battery up his ass. As she goes to punch him in his balls, which is pretty much all you could have asked for at that moment. And of course, I would just say, look, they didn't get 4 out of 4. Most of the villains in this movie all managed to get defeated using their own technology. So it's Buzzsaw gets cut by his buzzsaw. Guess what happens to Dynamo? Of course, there's a gun. The gun hits the water sprinkler system, which only in movie magic does the water sprinkler system perfectly turn on when it happens. And of course, water and electricity don't mix. And instead of singing his opera song, he screams violently and he dies in his Fruit Balloon 1987 underwear, which was not a sight that I needed to see, but it's there. And if you watch the movie, you'll see it. And then after Dynamo, that brings us to Jim Brown as Fireball. Now, I'm not gonna front. As a kid, my first thought was, why is the black guy gotta be so cold-hearted and evil? In retrospect, it was like, I think I was more terrified of Jim Brown than anybody else in this movie because
mhm.
everybody else was doing a whole bunch of yelling and grunting and screaming and shit. And Jim Brown came in like he was like Rakim, as in from Eric B. and Rakim, just like, I don't need to raise my voice. I don't need to scream. I'm just gonna kill you. This is like so.
And that was the thing that continues to be surprising about the Running Man is everyone has a little bit of a story and you're able to pull something from it. Like there was enough there was enough of Fireball to make that character compelling. This is the crowd favorite. This is the one you've been waiting for, everybody.
Yes, I mean, and look, he nailed the ex jock stuff perfectly. Like, when
Mm-hmm.
Buzzsaw's going up to go kill Schwarzenegger after Sub-Zero's been killed, he's like, let's win one for the zero. One of the most terrifying scenes for me in the movie when I was a kid was when Amber discovers the bodies of quote unquote last season's winners of the Running Man.
Hmm.
Whitman, Price, and Haddad, who you see at the beginning of the show, basking in the Maui sun. Now they've paid their debt to society and they survived the Running Man. In reality, all three of them died. And they made and when Amber finds them in their dog tags, which I thought only in an '80s movie could it be so perfect as they're literally announced as Whitman, Price, and Haddad, and she literally finds them in sequential order, like it's
Hmm.
a damn video game. Whitman, Price, and then Fireball shows up, and he's like Saddad, and she's like, "Oh, Little Running Man, last season's winners." He's like, "No, last season's losers." And then of course, thanks to the the magic of Hollywood in the 1980s, Arnold Schwarzenegger has now transformed into Spider-Man. He has climbed onto the ceiling where nobody can see him. He's able to reach down, grab Fireball's gas line, and conveniently, there have been gasoline and signal flares made available for Arnold. So when it's time to dispose of Jim Brown, of course, first it's the obligatory freak out, my gas line, my gas line. You're like, gee, I wonder what's going to happen.
Right.
And then it comes the, how about a light? And then that disposes of
See, it's
Fireball.
perfect.
Now, last but certainly not least, Jesse Ventura as Captain Freedom, who
Hmm.
you talk about characters where they put enough meat on the bone. I literally want to hear you break this down. I'm just gonna give the audience a quick synopsis. Imagine the jock who used to be the greatest of all time, now struggling with his role of being a quasi remembered as a champion, but being a has-been. All right, and I leave the rest of it to you to break down.
I mean, it's so interesting because we do spend because we keep coming back to that character as he himself is watching it go. You see a lot of things happening that I just didn't expect to. We keep coming back to Jesse Ventura. We keep coming back to Captain Freedom. We see watching, basically in the VIP room, right? Watching as Arnold goes through each of the stages and watching as each one of the stalkers is getting killed and like you see him starting to like that grimness starting to set in of like I'm not trying to die. I don't want to be the next person this guy kills. And like somebody who's been doing it long enough that you can see like that experience and that like understanding that like he's selling so much of the plot of this movie, right? Like he's selling that like this is not something that's supposed to be happening. He's selling like this is something that we haven't seen before and I don't want to be a part of facing. I've done my part. It's one thing to be has been. It's another thing to be dead.
Yes, and I will tell you the Captain Freedom workout clip, skit.
Yes.
I mean, sets up the character so perfectly. And there's this wonderful moment when they send Captain Freedom. People they're supposed to be sending Captain Freedom in because he's basically every other stalker's been killed, and he walks in, and I guess they were going to give him some kind of powered suit. And he's like, "Killian, forget it. I won't do it." And I cannot do the same justice describing it. You literally have to watch it. But it's the fact that they gave the character a sense of integrity. He's like, I'm not using gimmicks to kill anybody. He's like, 10 years
Yeah.
ago, I was killing guys like this with my bare hands. What does he
Hmm.
scream? This is a sport of combat and honor. Go to the gladiators. I love
I
Killing's
mean,
response.
they did give him the worst armor I have
Yes,
ever
they did. I
seen.
mean,
Like it was like a microwave strapped to his chest and like an arm that didn't bend.
no,
Uh,
he looked like a
he looked like
broken GoBot.
Cybertruck.
He looked like a broken GoBot.
Hmm.
If you can remember Leader One, he looks like Leader One broken.
It's
Um, but so no, look, so and so that at that point, this is where I felt like the movie was actually really smart. So now, in terms of foreshadowing the reality we live in, they're like, oh, we'll just do CGI and artificial intelligence, and we'll wrap this up, and we'll go kill Schwarzenegger and his friends later. So they create a CGI fight between Captain Freedom and Schwarzenegger's character Ben Richards, where Ben Richards and Amber are killed, and so now they're like, okay, we can go hunt them down. Like we know generally where they are. Like
hmm
they've got to be within this general area. We'll just send in a truckload of soldiers and dogs and whatnot, and we'll just kill them off camera. But of course, in the midst of all of this, our heroes have been able to find the satellite, network relay to be able to capture the satellite that's broadcast to the Running Man, and to be able to send out resistances, who's never gets named because it's always just the resistance, right? To send out
That's
their
how you
pirate
do it.
signal, right? Their pirate signal to explain to everybody who's watching how they're being lied to. Which is and which kind of kicks off our grand finale. So I'll say first, I it's I mean the fact that Dweezil Zappa, Mick Fleetwood, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Maria Conchita Alonso, like only in an '80s movie could you get these people together and be like, and this is the resistance, and they're getting ready to go save the world. So at that point, we have our final showdown with Killian. I will say one of my favorite parts of this movie is when the resistance uploads their tape and it's basically re-edited footage from what you've seen earlier in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And it's done in such a smart way that it's like if I was running a political campaign right now, I would literally show that video to somebody and be like, I want you to do that against my opponent. Um, and then beyond that, I know Pete will hit you with the finer points. I'll just say, Schwarzenegger, they had, his closing one liner after killing Killian is, of course, is that hits the spot because we had seen a commercial earlier in the movie where Killian is talking about Cadre soda. See, you see how
You
Armand's
brought it back.
consistent?
I was just gonna say, I'm so proud.
um, Killian had a commercial spot featuring Buzzsaw and Professor Tanaka where he's talking about his cadre soda. To which in the end, Schwarzenegger's like, "Hey, that does hit the spot." As he proceeds to send Killian through an advertisement of Killian, and Killian dies in a fireball using a contraption of his own device. Like, imagine like a nightmare version of the rocket sled from Flash Gordon. That's basically how you end up into the game quadrants and the Running Man. He throws Richard Dawson in there. Richard Dawson tells him to drop dead. Schwarzenegger's response is, "I don't do requests." He sends Killian off. Killian, of course, goes hurtling out of control, flies into a big advertisement for Cadre Cola. Of course, he hits himself and dies in the explosion, to which Schwarzenegger watching says, that hit the spot, which was the Killian's exact line from the commercial. And then at that point, cue the cheesy 80s music. And like in reality, it would be like, oh, all the American military is about to invade that television station.
Right.
Fight in there. But no, this is the 1980s. So we've got enough time for Schwarzenegger to be able to longingly listen out into the air now that his name has been cleared and to hear the masses chanting his name, for Amber to come up, for him to have Baby Pablo.
It takes so long too. Like they're in no hurry.
And he has what might be the second most aggressive kiss of the 1980s. Kisses her, and then he puts his hand on the back of her neck as if he was like, "Don't go anywhere." They all go screen. The movie ends, and I will say, without fail, I think of any Schwarzenegger movie, the main song for this movie has such a catastrophic disconnect from what the hell you've been watching for the last 90 minutes, because literally it's a love song, and it's like, "No more lonely nights," and you're like, I just watch somebody get their testicles chopped off with a buzzsaw.
No more lonely nights.
So that's the Running Man. I mean, it's a B movie. I'm not gonna pretend that it's anything that is not like a great thespian, experience. But Pete, one of the things that we talked about, especially with the VHS tapes, we always want to make sure we kind of like point out, the time period. And it's like the Running Man came out in a time period where kids, there's no streaming, there's no internet, there is not a cornucopia of content. You're lulled into a place where you can't even pick anything. This was on Friday night. You're not leaving the video store without something to watch. And the Running
sometimes,
Man, yeah,
sometimes that something is the Running Man. Yes.
And and I will tell you this: the Running Man was a notch above Iron Eagle. I mean, it was like, we really have to do Robot Jock and some of the Full Moon Picture stuff.
We will. I am excited. I'm excited for Robot Jock. With every movie that we're talking about, there were so many. It does feel like an exact era, the VHS era. of movies that were just big, and so like it was almost important just to see them, so you would have that as a reference point. It was almost like doing your homework, but in a fun way. Like these are the movies that we talked about as kids, and it didn't matter if they were good or bad. Almost like I've seen all the bad '80s movies, and I've seen all the good '80s movies. It is because they, in a certain way, they were kind of equal to me, and maybe that's because when it's 7 o'clock at the video store, and you've got choices to make. Like sometimes that's what you come away with.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I mean, I think it's interesting because, look, it's a science fiction movie, and science fiction movies do a great job of foreshadowing, the future. A lot of the technology from The Running Man is a lot of stuff that we actually have running around technologically now. Ironically, thematically, if you love like stuff like Squid Game, like that, this is like these are the guts and the bones of that concept and that idea. And I have always said that The Running Man, I think of any of the Schwarzenegger movies that haven't been touched, I would have loved to have seen. I would love to get both. I would love to get a faithful, remake that's true to the book, but I would also love to see a remake, kind of like what they did with Total Recall with Colin Farrell. I would love to see a remake of just this movie, because I think the themes, totalitarianism, capitalism run amok, the commodification of human life, reality TV shows, game shows. I feel like it's just a lot of ripe material. I think a new Running Man movie could be really fantastic, and I think it would really kind of capture modern audiences. And I would love to see what else they allude to in terms of what's coming down the road. But that is The Running Man. It is available. The 4K restoration version is available via Arrow Radio, who is not a sponsor. Arrow Films. Arrow Films. So definitely check that out. Beyond that, we will be back very soon with another VHS cassette tape to sit back and play for you. Please make sure, and it is VHS, not Betamax. Only VHS. No, we can't do Betamax. I'm sorry. I mean, maybe if we get fancy one day, we'll do Laserdisc, because you had some big money in the 80s if you had Laserdisc. And Laserdisc, that was like, the disc was the size of an LP. Now, it's funny, and I say that, and a lot of you might not even know what an LP is. It was a big record. it was a big silver shiny record. But for Pete, this is Armand. For more 80s nostalgia, check out popcultureuncovered.com. Definitely check out our previous episode where we discussed Iron Eagle, which is it's Louis Gossett Jr. and Jason Gederick stealing airplanes, and fighting for America. Like what? Like how could you not want to listen to that? Of course, listen, and subscribe. Please write a review. It really helps us out, as you can imagine. And for Pete, this is Armand. We'll holler at you soon. Take care, and keep running.